Imagine being a successful CEO, someone who holds immense wealth and power in their hands. But what happens when you decide to step into the lives of ordinary people, hiding your identity to truly understand those who suffer the consequences of your decisions? This is not just a story of wealth and power, but a deeply emotional journey of guilt, redemption, and the discovery of true compassion. In the heart of San Francisco, amidst a secret auction that only the wealthiest could attend, Julia Carter, a single mother drained of all hope, stepped into the lavish setting with a heavy heart. Behind her calm exterior was a daily battle for survival. Unpaid bills, eviction threats, and her young son Ben's innocent question about what's for dinner haunted her every waking moment. Julia had no other choice. This auction was her last resort to save her small family. Surrounded by the dazzling glow of gilded chandeliers, Julia sat in the darkest corner, trying to suppress the overwhelming anxiety rising within her. When the name Julia Carter was announced, she walked to the stage like the lead actor in the most critical performance of her life. Every shaky step she took led her closer to an uncertain, but necessary future for her son. Julia Carter, a single mother, was standing at that threshold. Her small apartment, once a warm haven filled with laughter, had become empty and cold. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, the refrigerator stood bare, and every night she watched her son Ben drift off to sleep with an empty stomach, a pain she could no longer bear. That night, Julia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting a dress she never thought she would wear. Every step she took toward the secret auction felt as heavy as lead. This wasn't a choice, it was survival. When the large doors opened, the dazzling light from the opulent chandeliers illuminated the room filled with powerful and wealthy men. Julia felt small, like an object on display. Her heart pounded in her chest as the announcer called out, "Lot number 23. Julia stepped onto the stage, her eyes meeting the scrutinizing gazes of the audience. Then from the far end of the room, a deep, commanding voice broke through the murmurs. $1 million. The room instantly fell silent. All eyes turned toward the man who had spoken. It was David West, a mysterious tech billionaire with piercing eyes and an undeniable aura of authority. Julia could only hold her breath, realizing that her life had just taken a turn she could never have imagined. This is how Undercover CEO begins, with difficult choices, hidden mistakes, and a deeply emotional journey of redemption. Don't forget to hit subscribe on the Soul Deep Stories channel so you won't miss a single moment. Julia's journey and the secrets of Undercover CEO have just begun, and you won't want to miss a second. Join us as we follow the journey to the end to see how this captivating story unfolds. Keep your composure, smile, and don't look directly at the guests, the organizer instructed before stepping away, his sharp suit disappearing into the sea of opulence. The hall was a world completely different from anything Julia Carter had ever known, filled with men in elegant attire and the scent of expensive cologne, each man carefully observing the women on display as priceless works of art in an exclusive gallery. Julia's heart pounded wildly when her name was announced, her body frozen for a moment before her legs hesitantly carried her forward. Lot number 23, the organizer declared, his voice practiced and dramatic. Julia's legs trembled as she ascended the steps to the brightly lit stage. The glaring lights momentarily blinded her, and the intense heat from the spotlights made beads of sweat form on her forehead. She forced herself to stand tall, keeping her chin lifted, though she could feel the weight of the crowd's predatory gazes bearing down on her. A true beauty, the organizer continued, his words meant to highlight her features but only making Julia feel more vulnerable. The murmurs of approval from the crowd buzzed in her ears, growing louder as they scrutinized every inch of her, from her hair, the bare skin of her chest barely concealed by the thin, tattered dress, to her bare feet, standing on the cold floor. Julia clenched her fists tightly at her sides, determined to endure this moment for Ben, her son, who was waiting for her back at home. Then suddenly a deep, commanding voice sliced through the noise. 2 million, the voice rang out. The room immediately fell into silence. All eyes turned in unison, searching for the man who had made such an unbelievable bid. At the farthest row, with an air of calm authority, stood a man with tan skin and piercing eyes that seemed to cut through the chaos. David West. A tech billionaire renowned for his brilliance, yet also an enigmatic figure. The auctioneer, clearly stunned by the unprecedented bid, hesitated before regaining his composure. 2 million once, twice, sold, he finally announced, his voice filled with a mix of awe and satisfaction. Julia's knees buckled slightly as she descended the stage, her heart racing wildly in her chest, the thin, tattered dress clinging to her form, making her seem even more alluring. She was escorted to a private lounge where David West was waiting for her. He stood as she entered, his piercing gaze locking onto hers, exuding an unwavering sense of determination. "We need to discuss the terms," he said in a calm yet firm voice, gesturing toward a chair across from him. Julia hesitated, unsure of what awaited her, before finally sitting down. In that moment she realized this wasn't just a transaction. It was the beginning of something far more complex. Something that would challenge her in ways she had never imagined. Julia's breath caught in her throat, but she knew there was no turning back now. With a subtle nod, she followed him down a dimly lit corridor that led to a private lounge, where the truth of what had just transpired would be laid bare. The room was spacious and tastefully decorated, every detail exuding luxury and complete control, with the security systems and cameras positioned everywhere. The sparkling light illuminated her flushed cheeks. David gestured for her to sit in a plush velvet chair, then moved to a nearby table where an envelope was waiting. He picked it up and turned back to face her. "Here's the contract," he said, handing it to her. "Read it carefully." Julia's hands trembled as she took the document, her pulse quickening with each beat. The silence in the room was suffocating as her eyes scanned the dense text, moving from one clause to another. At first, the words seemed distant, almost abstract, until she reached the section that stopped her cold. Her voice quivered as she read aloud, "You want me to have a child, and then leave it with you?" David crossed his arms, his stance unwavering. "I need an heir," he said simply, his tone devoid of any apology. "After the child is born you'll leave. The contract makes that very clear." Julia felt the weight of his words sink into her chest like lead. The room seemed smaller, the walls pressing in on her as she struggled to process the enormity of what had just been asked of her. "I can't do this," she said, her voice cracking as she stood abruptly, clutching the contract tightly in her hands. "I can't abandon my own child." David's gaze darkened, but his voice remained calm, almost cold. "You knew what you were getting into when you stepped onto that stage. Regret isn't an option now." Julia hesitated, unsure of what awaited her, before finally sitting down. In that moment she realized this wasn't just a transaction. It was the beginning of something far more complex. Something that would challenge her in ways she had never imagined. Julia's breath caught in her throat, but she knew there was no turning back now. With a subtle nod, she followed him down a dimly lit corridor that led to a private lounge, where the truth of what had just transpired would be laid bare. The room was spacious and tastefully decorated, every detail exuding luxury and complete control, with the security systems and cameras positioned everywhere. The sparkling light illuminated her flushed cheeks. David gestured for her to sit in a plush velvet chair, then moved to a nearby table where an envelope was waiting. He picked it up and turned back to face her. "Here's the contract," he said, handing it to her. "Read it carefully." Julia's hands trembled as she took the document, her pulse quickening with each beat. The silence in the room was suffocating as her eyes scanned the dense text, moving from one clause to another. At first, the words seemed distant, almost abstract, until she reached the section that stopped her cold. Her voice quivered as she read aloud, "You want me to have a child, and then leave it with you?" David crossed his arms, his stance unwavering. "I need an heir," he said simply, his tone devoid of any apology. "After the child is born you'll leave. The contract makes that very clear." Julia felt the weight of his words sink into her chest like lead. The room seemed smaller, the walls pressing in on her as she struggled to process the enormity of what had just been asked of her. "I can't do this," she said, her voice cracking as she stood abruptly, clutching the contract tightly in her hands. "I can't abandon my own child." David's gaze darkened, but his voice remained calm, almost cold. "You knew what you were getting into when you stepped onto that stage. Regret isn't an option now." Julia's heart pounded as anger and despair surged within her. "This is inhumane," she hissed, her voice trembling. "You think you can just buy a child and discard the mother?" David stepped closer, his powerful presence filling the room. "I paid $2 million for this arrangement, Julia," he said, his voice deep but firm. "This wasn't a whim." Julia felt her hands shaking as she looked down at the contract, the words blurring in her vision. She thought of Ben, of the sacrifices she had endured to get to this point. Her resolve began to waver, and the gravity of her decision weighed on her like an unbearable burden. "This isn't right," she murmured, tears beginning to spill as she sank back into the chair. David moved closer, his eyes locking onto hers. "Right or wrong doesn't matter here. What matters is that you honor the agreement," he said, like a businessman focused on money, not emotions. In that moment, Julia knew she was trapped. With trembling hands she picked up the pen on the table and signed her name, accepting her fate with a heavy heart. David took the contract, his face unreadable as he stood up. "Good. Tomorrow morning, we'll proceed with the necessary medical exams, and you'll be taken to my estate. Get some rest," he said curtly before leaving the room. Julia sat alone, staring at the door he had just walked through. The contract, the stage, and the weight of her decision swirled in her mind. She had done this for Ben, but the cost of her decision had never felt so heavy. In her mind, she vaguely recalled what David had said. "After the child is born, you'll leave." The contract makes that very clear. His words echoed in Julia's mind, and tears began to fall, soaking into the worn-out fabric of her old shirt. She felt as though her life had come to an end. There was no more resistance left in her. He turned and left the room, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts and the crushing weight on her heart. She stared at her signature on the contract, her mind swirling with regret, anger, and heartbreak. With those words, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts and a sense of regret so heavy it felt suffocating. She looked at her signature on the contract, the ink still fresh as though it were mocking her. It felt final, as if she had just sealed her own fate. The next morning, a sleek black limousine stopped outside the modest apartment she called home. Inside, Julia hugged Ben tightly as if it were the 100th time she had done so, her heart breaking with every second that passed. She had told him she needed to go on a business trip for a few months, promising to call whenever she could. Ben, innocent and unaware of the profound sacrifice his mother was making, smiled up at her with unwavering confidence. "You'll come back soon, right, Mom?" Ben looked up at her with such innocence, his pink, tender cheeks already cracked and bleeding slightly from the harsh winter cold. Julia forced a smile, her voice thick with emotion. "Of course, sweetheart. Be good, okay?" As the limousine drove away, Julia looked out the back window, watching Ben wave enthusiastically until he became just a small dot on the horizon. Tears silently streamed down her face as the cityscape began to fade, giving way to the endless stretch of desert. The journey to the mansion was silent, the tension in the air almost palpable. Julia gazed out the window, her mind swirling as the barren landscape slowly gave way to signs of unimaginable modernity and luxury. Finally, the car approached towering iron gates that opened to reveal a vast estate, so grand it seemed to come straight from a dream, or a nightmare. The mansion was truly magnificent, with meticulously maintained gardens and a castle that exuded wealth. The sheer size of the estate made Julia feel small and insignificant, a clear reminder of the power imbalance that she was now a part of. David stood at the entrance, his demeanor as calm and aloof as ever. He motioned for her to follow him inside, his presence both commanding and distant. As Julia stepped over the threshold, she knew her life had been forever changed. The grandeur of the mansion overwhelmed her. Every corner of the space was designed to impress, from the gleaming marble floors to the intricate chandeliers, like beams of light raining down. Yet, despite all its beauty, the place felt cold, unwelcoming, a gilded cage. David's voice broke through the silence of her thoughts. "Your private space will be respected, but I expect you to fulfill your part of the agreement without question." Julia nodded, too exhausted to respond. She followed a kind-looking woman, Amira, who introduced herself as the housekeeper. Amira led her to a suite of rooms assigned to her, each one more luxurious than the last. But despite the comfort and elegance of the place, Julia still felt like an outsider in this world. That evening, as she stood by the large window in her new room, looking out at the endless desert, Julia clutched the image of Ben, her beloved son, tightly in her heart. She had done this for him. She repeated this in her mind over and over, even as the weight of her sacrifice pressed heavily on her soul. The iron gates opened, revealing gardens so meticulously maintained they seemed almost unreal, and a mansion that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Julia couldn't help but marvel at the grandeur, though it only deepened the feeling of how out of place she felt. David was waiting at the entrance, his expression unreadable but as stern as ever. Without wasting time, he guided her inside, his voice brief as he explained the house rules. "Your privacy will be respected," he said, his tone calm but firm. "However, I expect you to fulfill your part of the agreement without question." After speaking, he left her in the care of a staff member named Amira, a middle-aged woman with a friendly appearance and a warm smile, the only comfort Julia felt throughout the entire day. "Follow me," Amira said, leading her through the vast mansion. Julia's room was like something out of a luxury magazine, with refined decor in soft tones that radiated both elegance and extravagance. The bed was draped in high-quality linens, and on it lay carefully chosen clothes and accessories, a stark contrast to the simplicity of the life she had left behind. "If you need anything, I'll be nearby," Amira said kindly, her smile genuinely warm. Julia nodded in thanks, though she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of being an outsider in this place. As the evening wore on, Julia found herself standing on the balcony of her room, gazing out at the seemingly endless desert horizon. The view was breathtaking, but her mind was consumed with thoughts of Ben, the sound of his laughter, the way he would cling to her arm whenever she read him bedtime stories. The pain of being apart from him was suffocating, but she reminded herself that the reason she was doing all of this was for her son. Everything she did was for him, to give him the future he deserved. A soft knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Startled, Julia turned to find David standing in the doorway, his expression as calm as always. "Tomorrow morning we'll meet with my doctor," he said, his tone businesslike. "The necessary exams will be carried out to ensure everything is on track." Julia silently nodded, her stomach churning. David stood there for a moment as if he wanted to say something more, but then he turned and left without another word. When the door clicked shut behind him, Julia sank into the chair by the window. She could feel the weight of the entire day pressing down on her, her emotions a chaotic mix of fear, sadness, and determination. The mansion might be beautiful, but to her, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. That night, as she lay on the unfamiliar bed, sleep eluded her. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, counting the hours until morning, her mind consumed with one thought: her son. She recalled David's words before he left. "Tomorrow we'll meet my trusted doctor," David had announced before leaving the room. His tone remained as calm as ever, but for Julia, his words felt like a weight pressing down on her, making her feel suffocated. She nodded silently, the burden of her decision growing heavier with each passing second. There was no turning back now. The next morning Julia woke up early. The silence of the mansion made her uneasy, a stark contrast to the noisy bustle of her old apartment. Her first night here in this lavish golden mansion, a place many dream of, had been sleepless. Her mind constantly raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. The soft bed, the silk sheets, none of it could bring her peace. The reality of her situation weighed heavily on her, too overwhelming to ignore. A gentle knock on the door broke the silence. It was Amira, always smiling warmly as usual. "It's time, Miss Julia. I'll escort you to the car." Julia followed Amira through the mansion, each step making her more aware of the luxury surrounding her. The hallways were decorated with exquisite Persian rugs, large paintings by renowned artists, and wide windows that opened to meticulously maintained gardens. Every detail radiated wealth and power, but Julia hardly noticed. Her mind was preoccupied with the uncertainties of what lay ahead. The sleek, imposing limousine stood waiting like a sentinel at the front entrance. Julia climbed inside, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. The ride was silent, with the cityscape of San Francisco slowly giving way to towering modern buildings. Soon after, they arrived at a modern clinic, its pristine exterior gleaming under the morning sun. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile yet peaceful. Julia felt a knot tighten in her stomach as they were greeted by Dr. Ibrahim, a man with a soothing voice and professional demeanor. He offered her a reassuring smile, but it did little to ease her anxiety. After a series of thorough examinations, Dr. Ibrahim finally looked up from his notes and nodded approvingly. "Everything is in perfect condition. We can begin the process whenever you're ready." Julia smiled weakly, her head spinning. She glanced at David, who stood off to the side, observing everything with his usual composed demeanor. For him, this was just another step toward achieving the meticulously planned goal he had set. But for Julia, it was a painful reminder of the reality she would face. At the end of 9 months she would have to leave, leaving behind a part of herself. As they left the clinic, Julia felt a mix of emotions she couldn't fully process: fear, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope. The cost of the sacrifice she was making was heavy, but in the quiet moments of the ride back, she reminded herself of the reason she was doing all of this: for Ben. For his future. The mansion's gates appeared ahead as they returned, and Julia braced herself for the long days to come. This was just the beginning of a journey that would test her strength and change everything she thought she knew about herself and the man who now controlled her fate. The first fertilization process began in the cold sterility of the clinic. Julia nodded silently as the doctor explained each step, her anxiety carefully concealed behind an outward calm. She caught a glimpse of David standing in the corner of the room, his posture stern and composed, observing everything from a calculated distance. For him, this was just another step in the perfect plan he had mapped out. But for Julia, it was a painful reminder of the reality she would face. At the end of 9 months, she would have to give up a part of herself. Back at the mansion, Julia tried to shake off the weight of the day by exploring her new surroundings. Every room she entered seemed more extravagant than the last, as if David's wealth had no limits. The library, with towering shelves filled with books, its grandeur accentuated by the air of silent authority. The indoor pool, surrounded by gleaming marble columns, shimmered softly under the lighting. In the music room, exotic instruments from every corner of the world rested like forgotten relics, waiting for a touch that would never come. Despite the grandeur of the mansion overwhelming her, Julia felt that the place was empty, beautiful on the surface but hollow inside. She couldn't help but feel the overwhelming loneliness that seemed to permeate every corner of the space. Though David surrounded himself with beauty and opulence, his life lacked warmth. He rarely smiled, and his polite gestures, though precise, felt cold and distant. In the days that followed, David kept their conversations strictly professional. He spoke only to ensure that every detail of their agreement was followed. There was no warmth in his words, no attempt to build a personal connection. Julia felt like just another meticulously managed element in his world, a pawn in his larger game. However, as she wandered through the endless hallways of the mansion, Julia began to notice cracks in his impenetrable facade. The meticulous arrangement of the mansion seemed less like a display of power and more like an effort to create a sense of control amidst the chaos within him. She wondered, were there secrets hidden beneath his composed exterior? For now, Julia kept her distance, choosing to find solace in the quiet corners of the mansion. She spent her days wandering the gardens, losing herself in books in the library, or simply gazing at the horizon from the balcony. Though the surroundings were truly different from anything she had known, the emptiness mirrored her own loneliness. Each passing day deepened the distance between them. David's coldness only amplified the chill in their arrangement, and Julia tried to remind herself of the reason she had agreed to all of this. Every decision she made came back to one thought: Ben. He was the reason she endured the loneliness, the unease, and the heartbreaking reality of what lay ahead. Even in the most lavish rooms of the mansion, surrounded by a world of privilege, Julia still felt like an outsider. Yet, somewhere in the silence, she began to suspect that David might feel the same way. Julia felt increasingly out of place in the vast mansion. The emptiness of her new life weighed on her like a shadow. The long nights passed with her staring at the ceiling, her mind consumed by thoughts of her son. Was Ben happy? Did he miss her as much as she missed him? Mornings brought no comfort as she wrestled with the reality of what lay ahead, carrying a child that she wouldn't be allowed to call her own. In the second week, David announced that he would be hosting a formal dinner for his business associates. Julia was informed that she would need to attend as part of their agreement. Amira brought her a gown, a stunning masterpiece, with shimmering fabric that fit her perfectly. As Julia descended the grand staircase that evening, her steps faltered with uncertainty. The guests below observed her with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Some greeted her with polite nods, while others exchanged knowing glances that left her feeling exposed and vulnerable. However, David remained by her side throughout the evening, his presence both commanding and protective. "This is my special guest," he introduced her to the attendees, his tone leaving no room for speculation. When they stepped aside to a quieter corner, his gaze softened slightly. "Are you okay?" he asked, the question carrying an unexpected note of concern. "I'm trying to adjust," Julia replied honestly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. David nodded, his expression unreadable, and said nothing more. For him, these events were a formality, just another extension of his endless responsibilities. For Julia, however, the evening was overwhelming, a stark reminder of how foreign this world was to her. As the dinner progressed, Julia felt like a silent observer in a world she didn't belong to. The conversations around her revolved around wealth, power, and influence, things that seemed far removed from the struggles of her everyday life. Yet, she couldn't deny the way David's presence steadied her amidst the storm of unfamiliar faces and judgmental glances. By the end of the night, as the guests began to leave, Julia felt a wave of relief. She returned to her room, slipping out of the exquisite gown and into the comfort of her thoughts. The weight of her decision, the uncertainty of her future, and the ache of missing Ben all pressed heavily on her chest. For David, the evening had been another seamless performance in maintaining his image. But for Julia, it had been something much more, a small but significant step into a life she was still struggling to accept. As she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that, despite his composure, David carried a weight of his own. The dinner had been an exhausting plunge into a world Julia didn't fully understand. The conversations, the glances, and the formalities left her drained. Returning to her room, she immediately reached for her phone to call her neighbor and check on Ben. When she heard her son's cheerful voice on the other end, it was as if a weight briefly lifted off her chest. "Mommy, I got an A on my drawing," he exclaimed, the pride in his voice bringing a smile to her face despite her tears threatening to spill. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you," she replied, her voice steady even as her heart ached. When the call ended, Julia sat in silence, the longing to hold her son almost unbearable. But she knew she couldn't give in to the temptation to leave everything behind. She had made a choice and she had to see it through, for Ben's sake. As the days passed, Julia began noticing things about David that contradicted his rigid, almost mechanical exterior. He was meticulous and demanding, yes, but there were fleeting moments when he showed glimpses of humanity. One afternoon, as she wandered the gardens, she saw him crouched by a patch of vibrant flowers, carefully watering a plant that stood out among the others. Intrigued, she hesitated before approaching. "This plant, it belonged to my mother," he said, sensing her curiosity without looking up. His voice was softer, almost reflective. "She used to say that caring for it brought peace." For the first time, Julia saw David as something more than a powerful figure dictating her future. There was pain in his voice, a quiet vulnerability that made her pause. The plant, fragile yet thriving, seemed to symbolize a part of him he rarely allowed others to see. In that moment she felt a pang of empathy. Though their circumstances and motivations were worlds apart, both carried burdens that shaped who they were. Amira, the ever-warm housekeeper, also began to open up to Julia during the long, quiet afternoons in the mansion. Over cups of tea, she shared stories of David's childhood, painting a picture of a boy thrust into responsibilities far too early. "He lost his mother when he was young," Amira explained, her voice tinged with sadness. "And his father, well, he was a hard man. David had to grow up fast to carry the weight of his family's name. He's always been like this, controlled, composed. But beneath all that, he's not as cold as he seems." Julia listened intently, her perspective of David shifting with each story. He wasn't just the man who had signed a contract with her. He was someone carrying scars of his own, struggling in ways she hadn't realized. Though she still felt out of place in the mansion, these small moments, the quiet humanity in David's actions, the kindness of Amira, offered a sliver of solace. For the first time, Julia began to wonder if this journey might be more than just a transaction. Perhaps, amidst the uncertainty, there was room for understanding, even connection. As the days passed, Amira shared more stories about David's life, revealing how he had been thrust into immense responsibilities at a young age following the death of his parents. These conversations painted a picture of a man who had learned to bury his emotions beneath layers of control and composure. For Julia, these insights made David feel less impenetrable, less like the stoic figure who had dictated the terms of her life. Yet, despite this newfound understanding, the loneliness in the mansion remained. She avoided growing attached to its grandeur or to David himself, constantly reminding herself that her time there was temporary. Even so, amidst the isolation, Julia found small moments of solace. Her walks through the expansive gardens offered a rare peace, the vibrant flowers and gentle breezes serving as a brief escape from her reality. At night, she would sit on the balcony, gazing up at the stars and letting her thoughts drift to Ben. These quiet moments, though bittersweet, became her anchor. One evening, a soft knock on the door startled her from her reverie. When she opened it, she was surprised to see David standing there. He looked different, less rigid, his expression softened in a way she hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," he said simply, stepping into the room. Julia nodded and sat down, expecting instructions or another reminder of her obligations. But as he stood there, his usual confidence seemed replaced with something she couldn't quite place: uncertainty. "I know this arrangement is difficult for you," he began, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't intend to make it harder. I want you to know that despite everything, I respect your courage." Julia blinked, caught off guard by his unexpected kindness. She studied his face and for the first time, saw something beyond the composed mask he always wore. There was vulnerability in his eyes, a glimpse of a man who was trying in his own way to reach out. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice steady despite the emotions stirring within her. David nodded, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned to leave. The door closed behind him, but the moment stayed with Julia long after he was gone. That night, as she sat by the window, the memory of his words replayed in her mind. It was a small gesture, but it had meant something, a crack in the armor he wore so carefully. For the first time, Julia wondered if the walls between them might one day come down, if there could be something more beneath the surface of their arrangement. Though she wasn't ready to let her guard down, she couldn't deny the shift that had taken place. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her believe that, perhaps, there was more to David West than she had thought. The brief moment of vulnerability David had shown was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Julia's mind. Perhaps he wasn't as cold and calculating as he appeared. Perhaps, behind the polished facade, there was someone just as broken and guarded as she was. After he left, Julia found herself replaying their conversation in her head. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she wondered if there was a possibility, however distant, of discovering something deeper in their connection. Life at the mansion settled into a slow and predictable rhythm. The days blurred together, yet each moment seemed to add another layer to the complex dynamic between Julia and David. They were like mismatched puzzle pieces, trying to find a way to fit together within the constraints of their arrangement. Julia was acutely aware of the passing time and the inevitability of what was to come. The thought of carrying David's child filled her with a mix of dread and curiosity. Who was the man who had asked her to make such a profound sacrifice? What had shaped him into the person he was today? Despite her struggles, Julia began noticing the small details about the mansion that made it feel less intimidating. The expansive hallways, once cold and unwelcoming, now held subtle charms she hadn't seen before. The gardens she wandered daily revealed hidden nooks of tranquility. The faint hum of music echoing softly from the distant corners of the mansion suggested that someone, perhaps David, found solace there. Julia also began to settle into her new routine, though the weight of her decision never left her. Her nights were still restless, her thoughts filled with memories of Ben and the life she had temporarily left behind. But the days brought moments of clarity, glimpses of something unspoken between her and David. Though he remained largely distant, their interactions were beginning to shift. His words, once curt and transactional, occasionally carried a softer edge. And Julia, despite her better judgment, found herself drawn to the man behind the imposing exterior. She wondered if she was starting to see the cracks in his carefully constructed walls, or if she was merely imagining them. The mansion, with all its grandeur, was no longer just a gilded cage. It was a place of questions, of possibilities. Julia didn't know where this journey would lead her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that both she and David were on the cusp of something neither had anticipated. The garden became Julia's sanctuary. It was a place where she could escape the weight of the mansion and her own swirling thoughts. Beneath the warmth of the sun and the gentle sound of water trickling through the fountains, she found moments of rare peace. She began to notice that David also spent a lot of time in the gardens. He rarely approached her or initiated conversation, but Julia could sense his presence. He seemed to be observing her, though never in an intrusive way. There was a tension in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, something they both recognized but silently agreed not to address. One afternoon, while wandering through the vibrant greenery, Julia saw David standing by a tree, carefully pruning its branches. His movements were deliberate, almost meditative. She hesitated for a moment before deciding to approach. "Do you enjoy gardening?" she ventured, breaking the quiet. David glanced up briefly, his gaze meeting hers for just a moment before returning to his task. "It helps me organize my thoughts," he replied simply, his tone even but not unkind. Julia nodded, sensing a small opening in his otherwise closed demeanor. Though he was reserved, he wasn't entirely unapproachable. She chose to respect his space, stepping back to let him continue, but she couldn't ignore the curiosity growing within her. Beneath his rigid exterior, there was a complexity she couldn't yet unravel. That evening, Julia was surprised when David joined her at the dinner table. Until that night, her meals had been solitary affairs, served in the quiet corners of the mansion or her own room. His presence at the table felt significant, though his expression remained as composed as ever. As they ate, the silence between them stretched but didn't feel uncomfortable. It was a quiet acknowledgement of each other's existence, a shift from the impersonal distance that had defined their interactions so far. "Are you adjusting?" David asked suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness. Julia looked up, meeting his steady gaze. "I think so," she replied honestly. "As much as I can." David nodded, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. He didn't press further, returning his focus to his meal, But Julia couldn't shake the feeling that he was genuinely trying to understand her, even if in his own reserved way. David studied her, his gaze unwavering as if trying to read the thoughts she wasn't voicing. "I know it's not easy," he said after a pause. "But I hope you understand that all of this is necessary." Julia wanted to ask, necessary for whom? The words hovered on the tip of her tongue, but she swallowed them, deciding it wasn't worth the confrontation. Instead, she nodded and continued eating in silence. There was something about the way he spoke that suggested he carried an emotional burden of his own, one he was careful to conceal. His imposing exterior seemed less like an act of dominance and more like a shield he had built to protect himself. As the weeks passed, Julia began to notice small acts of kindness from David, subtle yet meaningful gestures that hinted at a deeper side to him. One day, after she had casually mentioned missing certain dishes from her homeland during a conversation with Amira, a tray of familiar foods was brought to her room. "Mr. West asked me to make these for you," Amira explained with a warm smile. Julia was taken aback. She hadn't expected him to listen, let alone act on something so small. The gesture was thoughtful, yet it left her puzzled. Was it a calculated move to make her more comfortable, or did it reveal a part of him he rarely showed? She chose not to say anything, unsure of how to interpret his intentions. It was difficult to reconcile the man who had so coldly laid out the terms of their agreement with the one who remembered her offhand remark about food. But as time went on, the subtle kindnesses continued. A book left on her nightstand after she had mentioned a favorite author. Fresh flowers placed on her balcony one morning without a word of explanation. Each act, though quiet, added another layer to her understanding of him. Julia couldn't ignore the growing complexity of her feelings toward David. He remained an enigma, a man who seemed cold and distant, yet occasionally revealed glimpses of warmth and humanity. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, she wondered if there was more to him than the man she had agreed to this arrangement with. Though she couldn't yet bring herself to trust him fully, these small moments planted seeds of curiosity and something she dared not name just yet, a fragile hope that beneath the surface, there might be a connection worth exploring. David's intentions were difficult to decipher. On one hand, he remained cold and distant, keeping their interaction strictly practical. On the other, there were moments that hinted at a quiet thoughtfulness, subtle gestures that suggested he cared about her well-being. One morning, Julia awoke to find a neat stack of books on her bedside table. As she thumbed through them, she recognized titles she had casually mentioned in conversation, novels and stories that had once brought her comfort. The discovery stirred an unexpected warmth in her chest. It wasn't just the gesture itself but the fact that David had listened, remembered, and acted on it. A defining moment came later that week, when Julia wandered through the mansion and heard soft piano notes floating down the hallway. The melody was delicate, almost melancholic, and it drew her closer. Curious, she pushed the door to the music room slightly ajar and stepped inside. To her surprise, David was seated at the grand piano, his fingers moving gracefully over the keys with a skill she never would have expected. "You play the piano?" she asked, her voice breaking the spell of the music. David looked up, clearly startled to be caught in such an intimate moment. His hands paused midair before he quietly replied, "My mother taught me when I was a child." "It's beautiful," Julia remarked, stepping closer. David's gaze dropped to the piano keys, and he pulled his hands away as if unsure how to respond to her compliment. There was a vulnerability in his demeanor, a glimpse of a man who, despite his rigidity, carried a deep emotional connection to his past. In that brief exchange, Julia saw a side of him she hadn't seen before. Someone who, beneath the layers of control and distance, had his own share of scars and memories. On another occasion, as Julia strolled through the gardens, she noticed David meticulously pruning a rose bush. His movements were deliberate, almost therapeutic. Sensing her presence, he glanced up briefly before returning to his task, making it clear he wasn't expecting a conversation. "You enjoy gardening?" she ventured, breaking the silence. "It helps me think," he replied simply, his tone calm but distant. Julia nodded, respecting his space but unable to ignore her growing curiosity about the man behind the mask. These glimpses of humanity, the piano, the books, the quiet moments in the garden, were like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit the picture she had of him. For the first time, Julia began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed armor. Beneath the surface, there was someone she was only beginning to understand. Though the path ahead remained uncertain, these moments made her wonder if their connection might grow into something neither of them had anticipated. One quiet afternoon, Julia was strolling through the garden when a sudden flutter caught her attention. A small bird had fallen from a tree, its wing bent at an awkward angle. Without hesitation, she knelt down, cupping the fragile creature gently in her hands. As she examined the bird, David appeared nearby, watching her with quiet curiosity. "What will you do with it?" he asked, his tone calm but inquisitive. "I'll take care of it," Julia replied, her voice filled with conviction. "Until it's strong enough to fly again?" David remained silent, but his expression shifted slightly. There was something in his eyes, perhaps admiration or perhaps something deeper, that suggested her simple act of compassion had touched him in an unexpected way. That evening, as the mansion settled into its usual quiet, Julia found herself reflecting on the moment. The bird, fragile and vulnerable, had reminded her of herself in this strange, imposing place. She couldn't shake the feeling that David had seen the parallel too. Though the nights in the mansion were lonely, Julia began finding solace in the small routines she had developed. She enjoyed wandering its silent corridors, marveling at the grandeur of the architecture, even if it felt more like a museum than a home. One evening, as she turned a corner, she nearly collided with David in the dimly lit hallway. He looked different, tired, his features softer than usual, the weight of his responsibilities clearly etched into his expression. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. Julia hesitated, then replied honestly, "Sometimes it's hard, with so much on my mind." David nodded, as though he understood completely. To her surprise, he gestured for her to follow him. "Come. Let's have tea in the library." The library, with its towering shelves and warm glow, felt inviting in a way most of the mansion didn't. They sat across from each other at a small table, a steaming pot of tea between them. The conversation began cautiously, but soon, the barriers that usually define their interactions began to fade. For the first time, they talked about more than practicalities and obligations. David spoke of his mother's love for music and gardening, the few moments of peace he cherished from a childhood otherwise filled with expectations and loss. Julia, in turn, shared stories of Ben. His laughter, his drawings, the way he lit up her world even on the darkest days. The conversation stretched longer than either of them expected. For once, the mansion felt less like a cold, empty space and more like a place where two lonely souls had found an unlikely connection. That night, as Julia returned to her room, she felt a quiet sense of ease she hadn't known in weeks. She still didn't fully understand David, but in that moment she felt closer to seeing the man behind the mask. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to see her too. For the first time, Julia felt as though she was beginning to see beyond David's carefully constructed mask. His sharp edges were still there, but moments of vulnerability and connection had begun to soften them. The changes didn't go unnoticed by the household staff. Amira, who had always been warm and kind, now seemed closer to Julia, treating her less like a guest and more like a friend. Even David appeared more at ease in her presence, though he maintained his usual formality. There was something different in the way he looked at her now, as if he were beginning to see her in a new light. In turn, Julia found herself feeling less isolated. Despite the transactional nature of their arrangement, she began discovering small moments of connection and meaning within the mansion's seemingly hollow grandeur. A shared conversation in the library, an unspoken understanding in the garden. These moments added texture to a relationship that had once felt impossibly cold. Yet, the reality of her situation loomed over her like a persistent shadow. Each day, Julia reminded herself that all of this was temporary. The contract still defined the terms of her stay, and she couldn't allow herself to forget why she was here. As the first signs of change emerged in their dynamic, Julia knew she needed to prepare for the challenges ahead. David was a complex man, and she was only just beginning to understand the layers of his personality. Beneath the wealth, the control, and the icy exterior, there was a person grappling with his own pain and responsibilities. Deep down, Julia sensed that their journeys were starting to intertwine on a deeper level. They were still two individuals navigating separate paths, but those paths were beginning to converge in unexpected ways. The days passed, and Julia found herself increasingly immersed in the rhythm of life at the mansion. She no longer felt like a stranger in its opulent halls, but rather a quiet presence shaping its energy. Her walks through the gardens became longer, her conversations with Amira more candid, and her interactions with David less guarded. There was still so much she didn't know, about him, about their future, but she couldn't deny the small but significant shift in their relationship. While uncertainty remained, so did the faint hope that, perhaps, this unexpected connection might grow into something neither of them had anticipated. For now, Julia focused on navigating the present, knowing full well that the challenges of the future would test not only her resilience but also the fragile bond she and David were beginning to build. As Julia settled into the mansion's routine, she tried to maintain emotional distance, reminding herself of the temporary nature of her stay. Yet, despite her efforts, small moments with David began to leave an impression on her. He, in turn, displayed a growing, albeit restrained, interest in getting to know her better. During one of their walks in the garden, she remarked on how the carefully tended plants reminded her of resilience and growth. David paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I see in them the future," he replied. "Something that needs to be nurtured with love and responsibility." The sincerity of his words moved Julia. It made her realize there were depths to him she had yet to uncover. Beneath the calculated decisions and unyielding exterior was a man who seemed to carry a quiet longing for something more meaningful. Over time, their interactions became more natural, even comfortable. Small gestures began to bridge the gap between them. David started asking about her likes and interests, listening intently to her responses. Julia, in turn, found subtle ways to show her appreciation for his attentiveness. Their conversations in the garden became a cherished routine, as did their evenings in the library. They often shared books and stories, finding a surprising ease in discussing topics that went beyond their agreement. One evening, as they sat surrounded by towering bookshelves, David asked a question that caught Julia completely off guard. "If you could change anything about your past, what would it be?" Julia hesitated, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the book she held. The question was heavy, layered with memories she didn't often revisit. "I think," she began slowly, choosing her words carefully. "I think I would have been more careful about who I trusted. But at the same time, I wouldn't change everything. Without the wrong choices, I wouldn't have been." Her son's name hung in the air like an unspoken truth, carrying the weight of her sacrifices and the joy of his existence. David studied her in silence for a moment, as though weighing the significance of her words. He didn't press her further, sensing the emotion behind her response. Instead, he shifted the conversation, giving her the space she needed. Despite the growing connection between them, Julia couldn't escape the uncertainty that gnawed at her. The contract remained an unyielding barrier, a constant reminder that their time together had an expiration date. No matter how much she found herself drawn to him, the thought of their arrangement ending in 9 months loomed over her. One night, as Julia sat on her balcony, gazing at the stars, she heard the sound of footsteps. Turning, she saw David approaching, his expression softer than usual. He gestured toward the empty chair beside her, and she nodded, silently inviting him to join her. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the vast sky above them dotted with shimmering stars. It was a moment of peace amidst the turmoil of their situation. "You think a lot about the future, don't you?" David asked, breaking the quiet. Julia sighed, her eyes still fixed on the sky. "I can't help it. All of this, it feels so temporary." David turned to her, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes met. There was an intensity in his gaze that made her heart race, a depth she hadn't seen before. "The future can be built, Julia," he said, his voice low but steady. "It all depends on how we choose to handle the present." His words struck a chord within her, filling her with a warmth she couldn't quite explain. They were simple yet profound, offering a perspective she hadn't considered. For the first time, Julia allowed herself to wonder if their connection could extend beyond the confines of the contract. Though the path ahead was uncertain, his words planted a seed of hope, a belief that perhaps the future wasn't as predetermined as it seemed. As they sat there under the starry sky, the silence between them felt different. It wasn't the distance of strangers but the quiet understanding of two people navigating their way through something neither of them had anticipated. Julia still couldn't ignore the realities of their situation, but in that moment she felt a fragile sense of possibility, a hint that maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to rewrite the story they thought had already been written. From David's words, Julia sensed something unspoken, a subtle promise that destiny might not be as fixed as she had feared. Though he hadn't spoken directly, his tone carried a quiet conviction that left her feeling a glimmer of hope. The atmosphere in the mansion began to shift noticeably. What had once been a cold, impersonal space was now softer, almost inviting. The staff, who had previously moved with quiet precision, seemed more at ease. Amira, in particular, took pleasure in seeing David become less isolated and more open. Julia felt the changes within herself too. For the first time in months, she felt as though she was reconnecting with a part of herself she thought she had lost. The part that allowed herself to feel, to hope, to believe in something beyond survival. Still, she was acutely aware of the crossroads she was approaching. The bond forming between her and David was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. The feelings developing between them were unexpected and complicated, given the rigid boundaries of their contract. Each day the weight of her secret grew heavier. The thought of David discovering the truth about Ben terrified her. Yet, the longer she kept it hidden, the more unbearable the burden became. The conflicting emotions churned within her, a mix of fear, guilt, and the faintest spark of longing. As dawn broke one morning, the soft light spilling over the mansion's grand halls, Julia felt restless. The connection between her and David was something she hadn't anticipated, and it left her unsure of what to do next. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him, but she also couldn't ignore the looming consequences of their situation. With each passing day the stakes grew higher. Julia knew she had to tread carefully, balancing the fragile connection she and David were building with the truth she carried. The mansion's walls, once a cage, now felt like a fragile bubble, one that could burst at any moment. Though the future remained uncertain, Julia chose to focus on the present. For now, she allowed herself to embrace the small moments of connection, knowing full well that the crossroads ahead would demand choices she wasn't yet ready to make. The burden of her hidden truth had become almost unbearable. After breakfast, Julia decided to take a walk through the gardens, hoping to find some peace among the flowers and trees. But her tranquility was shattered when she heard Amira's voice calling her, the urgency unmistakable. Hurrying back to the mansion, Julia stepped into the living room and froze. David stood in the center, holding a photograph in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was controlled, laden with tension. "Who is this boy?" he asked, his dark eyes fixed on her. Julia's heart stopped. She recognized the photograph immediately. It was of Ben, one of the few keepsakes she had brought with her. She had hidden it carefully, but somehow, David had found it. Her voice trembled as she spoke. He's my son." The silence that followed was suffocating. David's gaze bore into her as he walked slowly toward her, the photograph still in his hand. "You lied to me," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Why didn't you tell me from the start?" Tears welled up in Julia's eyes, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid it would complicate everything. Afraid you'd think I wasn't suitable for the contract." David crossed his arms, his expression hard as he scrutinized her. "And why," he asked, his tone biting, "did you agree to this, knowing you'd have to leave another child behind?" The question hit Julia like a blow. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before answering. "I did it for him," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "For Ben. For the bills I couldn't pay. For the nights he went to bed hungry. I didn't have another choice." Julia's eyes welled with tears, the secret she had been hiding now exposed. Her son, Ben, was everything to her at that moment, the only reason she clung to any hope. She thought about the contract, about the money she could earn from it, things she might lose both physically and emotionally. She feared that Ben would have nothing to eat when he was hungry, and that the unpaid bills would weigh heavily on her frail shoulders. But alongside this, a mother's worry rose within her. For Ben, for the money, she would have to give up another child, one that was about to be born and would also call her mother. She wondered why fate had to be so unfair to her, when all she was, a simple woman, wanted was to be a loving mother to her children. The pain of having to choose between motherhood and survival weighed heavily on her heart. Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. David's gaze faltered for a moment, a flicker of something, understanding perhaps, passing through his eyes. But he quickly masked it, his expression returning to its usual controlled state. "You should have trusted me," he said finally, his voice quieter but no less firm. "Trust is essential, Julia. Without it, this arrangement means nothing." Julia felt the weight of his disappointment, and it stung more than she expected. She had known this moment might come, but she hadn't prepared herself for how exposed it would make her feel. As David turned away, the tension in the room lingered, heavy and unresolved. Julia knew she had reached a turning point, one that could either shatter the fragile connection they had begun to build or perhaps lead to something stronger. That night, alone in her room, Julia stared at the empty space where the photograph had been. The truth was out, and she could no longer hide behind the pretense of her contract. What came next would depend on whether David could see beyond her lie to the reasons that had driven her to it. Later that night, Julia was surprised when David asked her to meet him in the library. The room was dimly lit, the warm glow of a single lamp casting long shadows over the walls lined with books. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the intimacy of the setting amplifying the weight of the moment. David sat in his usual chair, a folder of documents in front of him. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've reviewed the terms of our contract," he began bluntly. Julia sat across from him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "There's nothing in it," he continued, "that mentions the possibility of you keeping secrets like this. However, it also doesn't address how to handle the situation we're in now." She looked at him, unsure of what he was about to say. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Disappointment, yes, but also something softer. "I won't pretend this hasn't complicated things," David said, his gaze locking onto hers. "Trust is the foundation of any agreement, and yours has been shaken." "But," he hesitated, a rare pause that hinted at his internal struggle. "I'm not going to send you away. Not yet." Julia's breath caught. Relief and apprehension warred within her as she waited for him to continue. "I've made an amendment to the contract," he said, sliding the folder across the table toward her. "You'll remain here and you'll be allowed to visit Ben under specific conditions. But the terms of the original agreement stand otherwise." Julia opened the folder, her hands trembling as she skimmed the document. The fact that he was willing to compromise, to let her see her son, was more than she had dared hope for. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Because I understand that growing up without a mother by your side is the greatest wound a child can endure," he said, his voice softer. "And because I believe we can rebuild the trust that's been broken. But that depends on you." His words carried an unexpected weight, and Julia felt tears pricking at her eyes again. For the first time she saw not just the man enforcing the terms of a contract but someone who was trying, in his own way, to bridge the gap between them. As she left the library that night, the amended contract in hand, Julia felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and the faintest stirrings of hope. The road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, it felt like they might be able to navigate it together. Julia felt a wave of panic rise within her. "Please don't send me away," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'll fulfill my part of the agreement. I promise." Those words carried a weight and a pain that Julia hadn't expected. For the first time, she felt as though she was beginning to understand the reasons behind David's rigid demeanor. He wasn't just a man seeking an heir or enforcing a contract. He was someone carrying deep scars of his own. The next day, Julia was taken to visit Ben. The journey was long, her anticipation building with every passing mile. When they arrived, she barely had time to step out of the car before Ben ran into her arms, his laughter filling the air. "Mommy," he cried, his small hands clutching at her as if he never wanted to let go. Julia held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I've missed you so much, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. They spent the day together, playing, laughing, and sharing the small joys of life that Julia had missed so deeply. For a few precious hours, it was as if nothing had changed. But as the sun began to set, the reality of their situation returned. The time to say goodbye came too quickly. Ben clung to her, his innocent eyes searching hers. "When will you be back, Mommy?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. "Soon, my love," Julia promised, though the uncertainty of that word tore at her heart. She watched from the car as he waved goodbye, his innocent smile etched into her memory as they drove away. Tears streamed down her face, her heart aching with the pain of leaving him behind yet again. Back at the mansion, Julia entered the living room, both physically and emotionally drained. David was waiting for her, his expression calm but watchful. "How is he?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine concern. Julia sank into the sofa across from him, feeling completely vulnerable. "He's happy," she replied softly, her exhaustion evident. "But it's hard, so hard to leave him." David nodded, as though he understood perfectly. He didn't say anything more, but the look in his eyes conveyed something words couldn't: empathy, perhaps, or a shared understanding of the pain she carried. For a moment, the room was quiet, the tension between them softened by the unspoken bond that seemed to be forming. Julia realized that, despite everything, David wasn't as detached as he appeared. There was a part of him that cared even if he struggled to show it. As she retreated to her room that night, the day's events replayed in her mind. The joy of being with Ben, the pain of leaving, and the unexpected comfort she found in David's presence. It all felt overwhelming yet oddly grounding. Though her journey was far from over, Julia felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, in time, she might find a way to bridge the gap between the life she left behind and the one she was now navigating. In the days that followed, something unspoken but profound began to shift between Julia and David. The air between them grew lighter, marked by a quiet understanding and a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. David became more considerate in subtle but noticeable ways, and Julia, in turn, began to trust him more. Small gestures took on new meaning. Sharing a meal, chatting during a walk in the garden, or even a brief exchange of words became significant moments that hinted at the growth of their connection. One evening, as they sat in the library surrounded by the quiet weight of books, David broke the silence with a revelation that caught Julia off guard. "My mother died when I was young," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "My father? He was always distant, consumed by his work." Julia watched him closely, realizing he was sharing something deeply personal. She could see the tension in his posture, the struggle to put such a painful memory into words. "That must have been difficult," she said sincerely, her tone gentle. "It was," David admitted, his gaze distant. "But I think it shaped who I am today. Even so, no matter how hard I try, I can't shake the feeling that something will always be missing." Julia felt an urge to comfort him, to bridge the emotional distance that still lingered. But she knew David well enough by now to understand that some of his barriers would take time to lower. Even so, his vulnerability in that moment brought them closer. As the months passed, their relationship continued to evolve. What had started as a cold, transactional arrangement began to shift into something more nuanced and unexpected. Julia found herself looking forward to their quiet evenings in the library or their walks through the garden, moments where the masks they both wore seemed to slip away. David, too, seemed to open up in ways she hadn't anticipated. Though he still held himself with his usual composure, the glimpses of humanity he revealed, his memories, his small acts of thoughtfulness, hinted at a man who was slowly learning to trust as much as she was. Yet, Julia couldn't ignore the complexities of their situation. The contract that had brought them together still loomed over them, its terms a reminder of the temporary nature of their bond. Even as they grew closer, the future remained uncertain, and Julia knew they were navigating uncharted territory. Despite the challenges, she allowed herself to hope. For the first time since stepping into the mansion, she began to believe that perhaps their connection could become more than what was written in the terms of their agreement. A bridge between two wounded souls searching for something neither had thought they needed. What had started as a cold, transactional agreement between Julia and David had evolved into something marked by mutual respect and quiet admiration. Julia began to see David not just as a powerful man enforcing a contract but as someone capable of profound humanity. His small acts of thoughtfulness and moments of vulnerability revealed layers she hadn't expected. In turn, David saw in Julia a strength and compassion that challenged his initial perceptions. She wasn't just someone fulfilling an obligation, she was someone with a depth of character that he couldn't ignore. Still, they both knew time was passing. The shadow of the contract loomed constantly, a reminder that their growing connection would soon be tested by the uncertain future awaiting them. After Julia's visit to Ben, the mansion settled into a strange calm. There was something different in the way she and David interacted. What had once been a tense, formal relationship now felt infused with a quiet acceptance, as though they were beginning to navigate their unusual circumstances together rather than apart. Julia found solace in her small routines. Her morning walks in the garden provided a brief escape, her afternoons reading in the library offered comfort, and her nights spent stargazing on the balcony allowed her a moment of reflection. But despite these pockets of peace, the thought of Ben never left her. His voice echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of the sacrifices she was making for his future. One morning, as she sipped her coffee in the sunny corner of the dining room, Julia was surprised by David's arrival. He seemed more relaxed than usual, his expression carrying an almost friendly warmth that caught her off guard. "Good morning," he said, his tone lighter than she was used to. "Good morning," Julia replied, watching him curiously as he poured himself a cup of coffee and joined her at the table. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the soft clinking of cups and the hum of distant sounds from the mansion filling the air. "You seem different today," Julia ventured, her curiosity getting the better of her. David glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone thoughtful, "about how this arrangement has changed. About how we've changed." Julia tilted her head, intrigued. "And what have you concluded?" "That perhaps change isn't such a bad thing," he replied, meeting her gaze with a sincerity that made her heart skip a beat. The moment hung between them, fragile yet significant. Julia felt a warmth she hadn't anticipated, a sense that, despite the uncertainties surrounding them, they were beginning to build something real. The weight of the contract still lingered, but for now she allowed herself to embrace the present. Whatever the future held, Julia couldn't deny the growing bond between them, a connection that had become far more than either of them had intended. "I want you to come with me today," David said, breaking the silence as he entered the room. Julia looked up from her book, intrigued. "Where to?" she asked. "I have a meeting at one of my family's properties," he replied. "It's a quiet place and I think you'll like it." She hesitated, unsure of what the day might hold, but the prospect of leaving the mansion, if only for a little while, was too tempting to pass up. "All right," she said finally. The car ride was quiet but not uncomfortable. David drove with a calm ease, his focus on the road, while Julia watched the scenery transform. As they left the bustling city center, the noise and chaos gave way to the serene expanse of sand dunes. After nearly an hour, they arrived at a secluded property surrounded by rolling desert sands. The sight took Julia by surprise. The house, built in a traditional style, was simple yet elegant, its charm rooted in its understated beauty. "This was my mother's retreat," David explained as they stepped out of the car. "She used to come here whenever she needed peace." Julia followed him inside, her eyes taking in the cozy atmosphere. Unlike the grandeur of the mansion, the house felt warm and inviting. The walls were adorned with colorful rugs and antique lanterns, and the air carried the subtle, comforting scent of aromatic herbs. David led her to a terrace that overlooked the endless expanse of desert. The view was breathtaking, the stillness of the scene almost surreal. The only sounds were the soft whispers of the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves from a lone tree nearby. Julia leaned on the railing, taking in the serene beauty of the place. "It's incredible," she said softly. David stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is the only place where I feel like I can think clearly," he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "It's beautiful," Julia replied, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon. David remained silent for a moment, his expression contemplative. Then, breaking the quiet, he asked, "Do you miss your home?" Julia sighed, her thoughts drifting to the life she had left behind. "I miss what it represented," she admitted. "A simple place but full of memories." David nodded, his understanding clear in the small gesture. There was something comforting about the moment, a connection that didn't need words. It was a brief respite from the complexities of their arrangement, a shared pause in the noise of their separate worlds. After their visit to the retreat, their relationship began to feel more natural. David started involving Julia in aspects of his life he had previously kept distant. Meetings with the mansion staff, decisions about the daily routines of the household. For Julia, these moments were opportunities to see the man behind the facade of the calculated businessman. She began to understand his habits, his priorities, and the careful precision with which he approached every aspect of his life. One evening during dinner, David brought up an unexpected topic. "I've been thinking about making some renovations to the mansion," he said casually, his tone light. "Something to make it feel more welcoming." Julia raised her eyebrows, surprised. "Welcoming?" she echoed, a slight smile playing on her lips. David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's always been a house designed for appearances, grandeur, tradition, control. But it doesn't feel like a home." Julia studied him, her curiosity piqued. The admission was uncharacteristic, yet it hinted at the changes she had started to notice in him. "And what would you change?" she asked, genuinely curious. David leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "A space that feels alive," he said finally. "Where people can feel at ease." His words hung in the air, and Julia couldn't help but wonder if the changes he was envisioning for the mansion mirrored the changes he was experiencing within himself. For the first time she saw a glimpse of a man who wasn't just building a legacy but searching for a sense of belonging. A man who, like her, was starting to discover that home was more than just a place. The conversation left her with a quiet sense of hope. Perhaps, amidst the complexities of their arrangement, they were both beginning to find something they hadn't expected. A connection that could redefine what home truly meant. "What do you have in mind?" Julia asked, her voice laced with curiosity. David glanced away briefly, his gaze settling on the edge of the table as if avoiding something too vulnerable to confront directly. "I want to create a space where a family could feel at home," he said, his tone quieter than usual. Julia felt her heart tighten at his words. It was the first time he had spoken of a future that included more than just their contract. The idea stirred something in her, though she knew better than to let herself get carried away. There was still so much unresolved, so many barriers to overcome before such a vision could become reality. One afternoon, as Julia walked through the gardens, she came across Amira carrying a tray of tea and cookies. The housekeeper's demeanor was unusually cheerful, her eyes sparkling as she moved with a lightness that Julia couldn't ignore. "You seem especially cheerful today, Amira," Julia remarked, unable to suppress a smile. "Did something happen?" Amira turned to her with a knowing smile. "It's just nice to see how things are changing around here," she said. "The mansion has never felt so full of life." Julia felt her cheeks warm, the implication of Amira's words clear. She didn't respond, but inwardly she acknowledged the truth in the housekeeper's observation. The dynamic between her and David was undeniably shifting. Even though uncertainty still loomed over the future, it was hard to deny that something was blossoming. As the days passed, Julia began to notice subtle changes in David as well. He spent more time with her, his reserved nature softening in small but meaningful ways. His gestures, once calculated and distant, now felt thoughtful and sincere. He would join her for tea in the afternoons or take a walk with her in the garden, the conversations between them growing deeper and more personal. The formality that once defined their interactions was giving way to a tentative sense of comfort, a fragile bond that neither seemed willing to break. Though Julia couldn't fully define what was happening, she felt the walls between them slowly crumbling. David's actions showed her that he was changing, not just for the sake of the arrangement but for reasons she was only beginning to understand. For the first time, Julia allowed herself to wonder if the mansion, once so cold and isolating, could become something more, if the connection she and David were building could outlast the contract that had brought them together. The future remained uncertain, but for now she chose to embrace the quiet moments that hinted at the possibility of something neither of them had planned. Over time, David began to reveal a side of himself that Julia hadn't seen before, vulnerable, approachable, and even warm. Conversations that were once curt and formal began to stretch into hours, with both of them sharing stories about their lives and the experiences that had shaped them. During one of these quiet exchanges, David shared something that deeply touched Julia. "I never knew how to cope with losing my mother," he confessed, his voice heavy with unspoken emotion. "She was the anchor of our family. When she was gone, everything fell apart." Julia felt a wave of empathy wash over her. She understood, in her own way, what it was like to lose someone important, even if her loss had been different. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her sincerity clear. David's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he nodded, as if her understanding provided a small measure of comfort. The vulnerability of that moment created an even stronger bond between them, something neither of them could have predicted. Despite their growing closeness, Julia couldn't ignore the shadow of the contract that still loomed over them. The more attached she became to David, the more the reality of their situation weighed on her. Their relationship, however unexpected, was confined by the terms of an agreement that had initially been purely transactional. Sleepless nights became her norm, as she lay awake wondering about the future and how to reconcile her feelings with her responsibilities. The thought of Ben, the child she was carrying, and the uncertain path ahead consumed her. One night, a knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. David stood in the hallway, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something more unsettled. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Julia nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He sat down in the chair across from her bed, his expression thoughtful, as though he was grappling with something important. "I know we have our limitations," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "But I want you to know." He paused, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment Julia felt the weight of his uncertainty. It was clear that whatever he was about to say carried significant meaning. "I want to find a way to make this work," he finally said. "Not just the terms of the contract but us. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know it's worth figuring out." Julia's heart raced at his words. She didn't know how to respond, the complexity of their situation making it difficult to fully process what he was saying. But in that moment she saw a man who wasn't just following the rules of an agreement. He was reaching for something more, something undefined but deeply human. And for the first time, Julia allowed herself to believe that perhaps they could build something real amidst the uncertainty. "I'm trying to understand what all of this means," David admitted, his voice quieter than usual, his words carrying a vulnerability that wasn't lost on Julia. Her heart raced at the weight of his confession. There was something in his tone, something unspoken, that hinted at a significant shift in their dynamic. "I'm trying too," Julia replied honestly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. David nodded, seeming relieved by her response. For a moment, the air between them felt lighter, as if the uncertainties surrounding them were no longer insurmountable. Despite the challenges ahead, it was clear that both were willing to face whatever came next, together. The changes didn't go unnoticed by the staff at the mansion. Amira, always observant, remarked on how much more at ease David seemed. "He's lighter, more human," she said with a warm smile. Other employees quietly agreed, commenting on how Julia's presence had softened the once cold and impersonal atmosphere of the house. For her part, Julia began to feel more at home. Though the weight of the contract was still present, the mansion no longer felt like just a temporary stop. It was becoming a place where she was building something she couldn't yet fully define but sensed was important. Each night, as she gazed at the stars from her balcony, Julia found herself reflecting on the journey she and David had begun. The bond forming between them was something she hadn't planned for but now felt inevitable. They were both changing in ways neither had anticipated. Julia, once so focused on fulfilling her obligations, was beginning to see the possibility of a future beyond the constraints of the contract. David, who had built his life around control and detachment, was slowly opening himself up to connection and vulnerability. It was as though the journey they had started together was taking on a life of its own, evolving into something neither of them could have foreseen. Was beginning to feel like a home. She was approaching a turning point, once an enigmatic figure bound by formality, but also was becoming someone she could trust, rebuild, and perhaps even more. The days at the mansion continued to pass, yet something undeniable lingered in the air. The connection between Julia and David was deepening, marked by small gestures, lingering glances, and conversations that stretched far beyond the practicalities of their arrangement. It was as though the boundaries of the contract were slowly dissolving, challenged by the unspoken emotions building between them. Despite the growing closeness, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that every shared moment was leading her closer to a critical juncture, one that would force her to confront not only her feelings but the precarious balance of their situation. One morning, as David sat in his office, reviewing a stack of documents, Julia walked in carrying a tray of coffee. He looked up, his expression briefly startled before slipping back into his usual composure. She set the tray on the desk, her movements purposeful yet casual. "I thought you could use a break," she said, attempting to sound nonchalant. David studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Lately it's been hard to stay focused." Julia hesitated for a moment before sitting down in the chair opposite him. "Something with the business?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No. Just a lot to process." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It carried an unspoken understanding, as though both were weighing the thoughts they couldn't yet bring themselves to voice. Finally, Julia broke the quiet. "Do you feel you've made the right decision so far?" David looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart skip. For a moment he didn't respond, as though he was searching for the right words. "I'm not sure," he admitted finally, his tone measured but sincere. "I've spent my life making decisions based on logic, on outcomes. But this is different. It's not just about the results anymore." Julia felt her chest tighten at his words, the vulnerability behind them catching her off guard. For someone so guarded, so calculated, his honesty was unexpected and deeply moving. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is different." The silence returned, but this time it felt lighter, almost comforting. In that moment, Julia realized they were both navigating unfamiliar territory, bound by a contract but driven by something far more profound. As she left the office, the unspoken connection between them lingered. It wasn't just a matter of fulfilling obligations anymore, it was about discovering what lay beyond the terms they had set, and whether they were brave enough to embrace it. David's expression softened, his composed facade briefly giving way to something more human. "I'm not sure," he said quietly. "Life taught me to be pragmatic, but sometimes I wonder if being so rigid has distanced me from what truly matters." Julia sensed the vulnerability in his words. For the first time, it felt like he was admitting that this wasn't just about his family or business obligations, there was something deeper at stake. In the days that followed, their routine began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. David started inviting Julia to accompany him to meetings and social events, an acknowledgement of her growing presence in his life. He seemed genuinely interested in including her in his world, and for the first time, Julia began to understand the immense pressures and responsibilities he carried. During a charity dinner, David introduced Julia to the guests as his companion. The declaration sent a ripple of curiosity through the room, evident in the glances and murmurs exchanged among the attendees. Yet, David seemed completely indifferent to their opinions, his confidence unwavering. Julia, on the other hand, felt uneasy under the weight of the attention. The scrutiny, the whispers, It was a world she had never imagined being part of, and it left her feeling exposed. Sensing her discomfort, David led her to a quieter corner, his voice low as he asked, "Are you okay?" "I'm getting used to it," Julia replied, forcing a smile to hide her nerves. In a gesture that surprised her, David briefly held her hand, the warmth of his touch steadying her. "Don't worry," he said softly. "I'm here with you." The simple gesture carried more weight than she expected. It wasn't just a reassurance, it was a promise, unspoken but deeply felt. As the evening continued, Julia found herself watching David in a new light. The way he carried himself, his ease in navigating the social dynamics, and his ability to command respect. It was clear that he was accustomed to being in control. But the moments when he turned to her, his gaze softening, hinted at something else. For David, the opinions of others were irrelevant, but for Julia, they were a reminder of how different their worlds were. Yet, in that moment she realized that he wasn't just introducing her to his world, he was inviting her to be part of it. By the end of the night, as they returned to the mansion, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship was evolving into something neither of them had planned. The boundaries of their contract were blurring, replaced by a connection that felt more real with each passing day. As she lay in bed that night, Julia reflected on how far they had come. For better or worse, their paths were now undeniably intertwined, and the future, though uncertain, seemed to hold possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. Those simple, reassuring words, "Don't worry, I'm here with you," filled Julia with an inexplicable warmth. It was a quiet yet meaningful promise that resonated far beyond the moment. As the days passed, their moments of intimacy became more frequent. Julia noticed that David was opening up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing details about his life that had previously been hidden behind his reserved exterior. He spoke of his childhood, the weight of his family's expectations, and the relentless pressure of maintaining the legacy he had inherited. In return, Julia began to share pieces of her own story, her struggles as a single mother, the challenges of raising Ben on her own, and the small moments of joy that had kept her going even in the darkest times. David listened attentively, revealing a side of himself that was more human and receptive than she had imagined. He wasn't just hearing her words, he was understanding them. One night, as they walked through the moonlit gardens, the silence between them felt profound rather than awkward. The soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of night insects created an almost magical atmosphere. Abruptly, David stopped and turned to face her. "Julia," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I want you to know that despite everything, you've shown me things I'd never noticed before." Julia blinked, taken aback by his candidness. "Like what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That there's more to life than obligations and contracts," he replied, his gaze locking onto hers. "That sometimes you need to make room for something new." Julia felt her heart race at his words. She knew she was falling for David, but she also knew the contract remained an unyielding barrier between them, a reminder of the limits to what their relationship could become. The changes in their dynamic didn't go unnoticed by the mansion's staff. Amira, always observant, remarked on how much lighter the atmosphere had become. "Mr. West seems different these days," she said to Julia one afternoon, her eyes sparkling with a knowing smile. "And I think you're the reason for it." Julia felt her face flush, unsure of how to respond. She couldn't deny the shift in David's demeanor or the connection that had grown between them. Despite the lingering constraints of the contract, Julia began to see the mansion not as a prison but as a place of possibility. The growing bond between her and David was undeniable, and though uncertainty still loomed, she couldn't help but wonder what might come next. For now, she chose to focus on the present, savoring the small moments that hinted at a future neither of them could have predicted. And as they walked back to the mansion under the moonlight, Julia allowed herself to believe, if only for a moment, that perhaps they were rewriting the terms of their story, together. Amira, ever observant, began treating Julia with a warmth that felt almost familial, as though she already saw her as a permanent part of the household. Other staff members exchanged knowing smiles whenever they caught sight of Julia and David together, their interactions no longer marked by distance but by an undeniable connection. Despite this shift, Julia couldn't ignore the weight of reality. With each passing day, the end of the contract loomed closer, a shadow that darkened even the brightest moments. The fear of losing everything, including the bond she had built with David, gnawed at her. One quiet afternoon, as Julia sat in the library with a book in her lap, David entered the room. His expression was somber, the usual calmness in his demeanor replaced by a tension that immediately set Julia on edge. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. Julia set the book aside, her pulse quickening. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the apprehension building inside her. David sat across from her, his hands clasped tightly on the table, a rare sign of unease. "We need to discuss the future," he began. "I know the contract outlines what's supposed to happen after the baby is born, but things have changed." Julia held her breath. She had known this moment would come eventually, but that didn't make it any easier. "What do you mean by that?" she asked hesitantly, her heart pounding in her chest. David took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "I want to consider other options," he said firmly. "I don't want you to just leave." Julia's heart raced at his words, the weight of their significance pressing down on her. She didn't know how to respond, torn between hope and uncertainty. What are you saying exactly?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. David leaned forward slightly, his tone softening. "I'm saying that I don't want our connection, what we've built, to end with the contract. I don't know what the future looks like yet, but I know I don't want to lose this, to lose you." Julia's chest tightened at his admission. The vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty in his words, were things she hadn't expected but desperately needed to hear. She looked at him, trying to gauge the sincerity in his expression. "Do you mean that?" she asked, needing reassurance. David nodded, his gaze steady. "I do. But I know this isn't just about me. I want to know what you want, Julia." His question hung in the air, and for the first time, Julia felt the fragile but real possibility of a future beyond the constraints of their contract. The uncertainty remained, but in that moment she realized that perhaps the path forward didn't have to be defined by fear, it could be shaped by choice. What David was suggesting was exactly what Julia had been silently hoping for, but the fear of raising her expectations held her back. She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities and doubts before finally asking, "And what does that mean?" "It means we need to find a way to make this work, together," David replied firmly, his words carrying a weight that echoed in her mind. Julia felt her heart stir with a spark of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. The situation was far from simple, but for the first time, she could see the faint outline of a future that didn't end with the contract. In the days that followed, Julia and David began speaking more openly about their fears, their expectations, and the emotions that had caught them both off guard. Neither of them had anticipated the depth of their connection, but they were no longer willing to ignore it. Julia started to envision a life where she, Ben, and David could be together, a real family. And David, once so focused on legacy and obligation, began to see the possibility of building something authentic and meaningful. Even so, challenges remained. David was still haunted by the expectations of his family, the weight of their legacy pressing down on him. Julia, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile the person she was becoming with the life she had left behind. The thought of how much her world had changed, and how much further it could shift, was both exciting and terrifying. Yet they found strength in each other. Their quiet conversations, shared moments, and growing trust became the foundation for something they couldn't yet define but knew was worth fighting for. One quiet evening, as they sat on the terrace beneath a canopy of stars, David turned to Julia with an expression she hadn't seen before. There was no calculation, no guardedness, just raw sincerity. "I didn't know what love was until you came into my life," he said, his voice soft but unwavering. The weight of his words hit Julia like a wave, and tears streamed down her face before she could stop them. She couldn't speak, her emotions too overwhelming to articulate. Instead, she reached for his hand, her touch saying everything her voice couldn't. In that moment, under the starry sky, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. Their connection was no longer defined by terms or obligations but by a shared understanding of what they had found in each other. Though their journey was far from over, Julia felt for the first time that love, not fear or uncertainty, was guiding their path forward. Tears streamed down Julia's face, but for the first time they weren't from sadness. Despite the challenges they had faced, something undeniably special had blossomed between her and David. The mansion, once cold and isolating, now felt like it held the potential to become a home. The bond they shared had grown stronger, deeper, something no contract could define or constrain. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow through the mansion's grand windows, Julia found herself in the music room, one of her newfound sanctuaries. She sat at the piano, her fingers gliding gently over the keys as she created a melancholic melody that filled the room with quiet emotion. The sound was interrupted by the soft creak of the door opening. Julia looked up, startled, to see David stepping into the room. "Did you teach yourself to play?" he asked, his voice breaking the spell of her music. She offered a faint smile, surprised by his unexpected presence. "My mother taught me when I was little," she said, her tone tinged with nostalgia. "It was something that connected us even in difficult times." David nodded thoughtfully as he stepped closer, his gaze lingering on the piano before shifting to her. He sat beside her on the bench, the proximity between them creating a quiet tension. As her fingers resumed their delicate dance across the keys, David watched her intently. After a moment he spoke softly. "You have talent?" Julia paused, the weight of his words settling over her. She could feel the unspoken emotions between them, a tension that carried both longing and hesitation. David remained silent, his presence steady but unintrusive. The moment stretched between them, filled with the resonance of the last note she had played and the possibilities that lingered in the air. For Julia, the piano had always been a way to express what words couldn't. And in that moment, with David beside her, it felt like the music was telling a story they were both just beginning to understand. A story of connection, vulnerability, and the hope of building something lasting amidst the uncertainty. For a few moments, there was only the soft hum of silence between them. Then David spoke, his voice steady but carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Julia, I've been thinking a lot about what we've shared, about what brought us to this point." Julia stopped playing, her hands resting on the keys as she turned to face him. The seriousness in his expression told her this wasn't just a passing thought. He was about to address something deeply important. "And what have you concluded?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm even as her heart raced. David took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering as he finally spoke. "I can't keep ignoring the feelings that have grown between us. But I also know that my past, and the expectations of my family, have always been obstacles." Julia felt a mix of hope and apprehension at his admission. David rarely spoke about his internal struggles, and hearing him confront them felt like a significant turning point. It was a sign that he was ready to face the demons he had kept hidden for so long. Later that evening, David invited her for a walk in the gardens. The gentle breeze and the soft rustling of leaves created a serene atmosphere, but the weight of the impending conversation hung between them like an invisible thread. As they walked side by side, David broke the silence. "My father was a strict man," he began, his voice steady but filled with an underlying pain. "To him, the family's honor was above all else. I grew up trying to meet his expectations and it shaped the way I see the world." Julia listened attentively, the vulnerability in his words drawing her closer. She could hear the weight of years spent trying to live up to an impossible standard. "When my mother died," David continued, his tone quieter now, "he became even more distant. Everything became about control, about making sure nothing could tarnish the family's name. I thought, if I just did what was expected of me it would be enough. But it never was." Julia felt a pang of empathy as she looked at him. His struggles, though different from her own, mirrored the weight of responsibility she had carried in her own life. For a moment the silence returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a bridge between their two worlds. "David," Julia said softly, "you don't have to carry all of that alone anymore." Her words hung in the air, and David's gaze met hers, filled with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. For the first time he seemed to consider the possibility that he didn't have to face his burdens alone, that perhaps together they could find a way forward. As they continued their walk, the gardens no longer felt like a place of solitude but one of connection, where the past and present could coexist, and where their shared vulnerabilities might forge a path toward something new. David's voice grew quieter, his words laden with reflection. Everything became about maintaining control, ensuring nothing strayed from the plan. Julia hesitated before speaking, her tone soft but curious. "And that's why you feel you need an heir?" David stopped walking and turned to face her, his gaze unflinching. "Partly," he admitted. "But also because, deep down, I think I've always been afraid of being alone." The honesty in his words struck Julia deeply, a pang of understanding tightening her chest. She knew that feeling, the quiet ache of loneliness that lingers no matter how strong you try to appear. Hearing it from David, a man who had always seemed impenetrable, made her see him in a new light. The next day, David asked Julia to join him on a trip to the desert. They left early, the soft glow of dawn casting long shadows as they drove away from the city. Soon, the endless golden sand stretched out before them like an ocean of stillness. Julia watched as the landscape shifted, its stark beauty captivating in its simplicity. When they arrived at a secluded oasis, the sight took her breath away. A crystal-clear pool of water reflected the sky, surrounded by lush greenery that seemed out of place in the vast expanse of desert. "This is a special place for me," David explained as they stepped out of the car. "A retreat I visit when I need clarity." As they walked along the water's edge, he continued, his voice thoughtful. "This place reminds me that even in the middle of the desert, there's life." Julia felt a connection to the moment, sensing that it was a turning point in their journey together. The oasis, with its quiet serenity, seemed to mirror the changes in their relationship. Unexpected, yet undeniably real. They found a spot beneath the shade of a palm tree and sat together, the stillness of the desert amplifying the significance of the moment. After a long silence, David spoke. "When I'm here, it feels like everything makes more sense. The noise fades and I can finally see what really matters." Julia turned to him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his words. "And what do you see now?" she asked gently. David hesitated as if weighing his response. "I see that I've spent so much time trying to control everything, to meet expectations, that I've lost sight of what I actually want." Julia felt her pulse quicken, his confession leaving her both hopeful and uncertain. She could sense that he was trying to navigate feelings he hadn't allowed himself to explore before. As they sat there, the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft ripple of water creating a peaceful backdrop, Julia realized that this trip wasn't just about clarity for David, it was about them. Their journey was no longer just about fulfilling an agreement, it was about finding meaning in the unlikeliest of places. "I've spent so much time trapped by the past and the expectations of others that I've never allowed myself the chance to figure out what I truly want," David said, his voice steady but tinged with regret. Julia looked at him, feeling the sincerity in his words. Her heart pounded as she asked, "And what do you want now?" David turned to her, the sunlight catching his eyes, making them shine with a clarity she hadn't seen before. "I want to live differently," he said. "I want to build something real, something not defined by contracts or obligations." Julia felt tears threaten to spill but managed to hold them back. His words were everything she had hoped to hear, a glimpse of the possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. Yet, uncertainty still lingered between them, unspoken fears and unanswered questions casting their shadows. When they returned to the mansion, the atmosphere between them felt lighter. There was a shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of what they were beginning to mean to each other. But they both knew unresolved issues remained, lurking at the edges of their connection. Julia spent her nights reflecting on her choices, her thoughts often drifting to Ben. The weight of her decisions and their impact on her son were ever present. She knew that if she wanted to move forward, she would have to confront her own pain and fears, no matter how difficult that might be. One night, as she stood on the balcony gazing at the starry sky, the soft sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see David approaching, carrying 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her, his movements unhurried and calm, before standing beside her in silence. For a few moments, they simply looked up at the stars, the quiet around them amplifying the significance of the moment. "This is peaceful," David said finally, his voice breaking the stillness. "It is," Julia agreed softly, the warmth of the tea in her hands grounding her. David glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" "All the time," Julia admitted, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "It's hard not to." David nodded, his gaze returning to the sky. "I don't have all the answers," he said. "But I do know that I don't want to lose what we've started here." Julia's heart ached at his words, the vulnerability in his tone reminding her of how much had changed between them. For the first time, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps the future wasn't as rigidly defined as she had feared. Together they had the chance to shape something new, something real. And as they stood side by side under the stars, the unspoken promise between them felt as infinite as the sky above. As they stood together under the canopy of stars, David spoke in a low voice, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You know, Julia," he began, "I never thought I'd meet someone who would make me question everything I believed." Julia turned to look at him, the weight of his words settling over her. "You've shown me that it's possible to have more," he continued, his gaze steady and sincere. "That there's room for something beyond responsibilities and expectations." Her eyes filled with emotion as she gave a faint smile. "And you've shown me that it's possible to find strength in the midst of pain," she replied. "I wouldn't have come this far without you." In the days that followed, David began taking concrete steps to change the dynamic between them. He reviewed the terms of their contract with meticulous care. While the clauses regarding the child's future remained, he made it clear that he wanted to find a solution that would be fair to both of them, a path that reflected the bond they were building. For Julia, the changes brought a mix of relief and apprehension. The revisions to the contract were a step forward, but she knew the challenges ahead would require more than just words on paper. Still, for the first time she felt as though they were moving in the right direction. David's actions were proof of his commitment, not just to the agreement but to the connection that had grown between them. It wasn't easy for him to confront the expectations and traditions that had defined his life, but he was trying, something Julia couldn't ignore. And while uncertainty still lingered, Julia sensed a shift in their relationship, a fragile but undeniable hope that they were beginning to rewrite their story. As they navigated the complexities of their situation, she found herself believing that, together, they could create something far beyond what either of them had ever expected. For now, the future remained unwritten, but the steps they were taking hinted at the possibility of a new beginning, one defined not by obligation but by choice. The changes in the mansion were undeniable. David's usual coldness had softened into a warmer, more approachable demeanor, and Julia, in turn, seemed more confident and at ease. The air between them was no longer charged with tension but infused with a quiet understanding. One afternoon, as Julia helped Amira arrange fresh flowers in the dining room, the housekeeper paused and said with a knowing smile, "I always knew Mr. West had a good heart. He just needed someone to help him find it." Julia smiled, a wave of gratitude washing over her. Amira's words echoed her own thoughts. Despite everything, she felt fortunate for how far they had come. Yet, for all the positive changes, Julia knew the future was still uncertain. She and David had built something unexpected, but the challenges ahead were undeniable. They would have to face their fears and continue working together if they wanted to build something lasting. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over the mansion, Julia and David sat side by side on the terrace, watching the horizon. The stillness of the moment reflected the calm before the storm. They both knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with decisions that could shape the rest of their lives. The atmosphere in the mansion had visibly changed. The initial tension and formality had been replaced with a lighter, more welcoming mood. The staff moved with a quiet ease, and the once cold halls now felt alive with the potential for something new. Despite the progress, the weight of the future still hung over Julia and David like a shadow. They were at a crossroads and the choices they would have to make weren't easy. But as they sat there, side by side, neither spoke of fear or doubt. Instead, they focused on the horizon, a shared determination binding them. For the first time, Julia felt that hope, a belief that love, trust, and the bond they had formed might be enough to overcome whatever challenges awaited them. The path forward wasn't clear, but they were ready to face it together, one step at a time. One morning, David called Julia to his office. The room, usually imposing with its grand desk and towering bookshelves, felt more intimate that day. His demeanor was calm but serious as he gestured for her to sit. Julia complied, a mix of curiosity and apprehension coursing through her. "I've been thinking a lot about our agreement," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And everything that's happened since you arrived here." Julia kept her gaze fixed on him, waiting for him to continue. "When we made this contract, my focus was on one goal, ensuring an heir for the family," David said, clasping his hands on the desk in front of him. "But things have changed." Her heart raced at his words. She had longed to hear something like this but feared what might follow. "And what does that mean?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It means," David said, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, "I want to find a way to make this work, for both of us. I don't want you to stay because of a contract. I want you to stay because we choose to be together." His words felt like a glimmer of hope, and Julia's chest tightened with emotion. It was what she had dared to dream of, yet she knew it wouldn't be simple. There were so many layers to their situation: her son, the expectations of his family, and the unspoken fears they both carried. She needed to be sure that this wasn't just a momentary change of heart, that the foundation they were building was strong enough to withstand the complexities of their reality. "I want that too," Julia said finally, her voice steady despite the swirl of emotions inside her. "But this is bigger than just us. There's so much to figure out." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know," he said. "And I'm willing to figure it out, together." For the first time, Julia felt that the walls that had defined their relationship were beginning to crumble. What had started as a cold arrangement was evolving into something real, something worth fighting for. As she left the office, her mind raced with both hope and uncertainty. The road ahead would be challenging, but David's words gave her the strength to believe that they might just be able to navigate it, together, by choice. Julia and David both knew the decisions they were making carried weighty consequences. That afternoon, as Julia wandered through the gardens, her thoughts drifted back to what David had said. As much as she felt strongly for him, the harsh reality of her situation loomed. Her son, Ben, was still in another city, and the contract had stipulated that she would leave after the baby was born. Later, as she passed by the central fountain, Julia noticed Amira tending to a bed of flowers. She paused, hesitating for a moment before deciding to speak. "Amira," Julia began, her voice laced with uncertainty, "do you think I can trust David?" Amira looked up, surprised by the question. She studied Julia for a moment before responding sincerely. "Mr. West is a man of his word," she said. "He never makes promises he doesn't intend to keep. But he's also human, Julia. Like you, he's trying to find a balance between what he feels and what he needs to do." Julia absorbed Amira's words, her tension easing slightly, though her inner conflict remained. The next day, David invited Julia to accompany him on a visit to an orphanage he supported, a place he had often visited before. But this time the trip carried a different significance. When they arrived, the children greeted them with laughter and hugs, their joy filling the air. Julia was caught off guard by the warmth and enthusiasm of their welcome. Watching David interact with the children, she saw a side of him she hadn't fully understood before. He knelt to speak with them at their level, his usually guarded expression softening as he listened to their stories and laughter. Julia felt a wave of emotion as she observed him. Beneath the layers of formality and control, there was a man capable of profound kindness and care. As she played with the children, Julia found herself smiling more freely than she had in weeks. Their laughter and innocence were a reminder of the simple joys she had often overlooked. On the way back to the mansion, the car was quiet, but the air between them felt different, lighter, more open. "You're good with them," Julia said softly, breaking the silence. David glanced at her, a faint smile touching his lips. "They remind me of what really matters," he admitted. Julia nodded, her heart stirring at his words. It wasn't just his actions at the orphanage that had moved her. It was the realization that David was capable of seeing beyond his own world and into the lives of others. As the mansion's gates came into view, Julia felt a renewed sense of hope. Their path was still uncertain, but moments like these reminded her that there was more to David than she had initially believed. And perhaps, amidst all the complications, there was a way for them to create something real together. Julia felt a wave of warmth as she watched David interact with the children at the orphanage. His usual seriousness gave way to a gentler, more caring side she hadn't seen often. He crouched down to speak to them, listened intently to their stories and even laughed, a sound so rare it caught her off guard. "You truly care about them," Julia said softly as they stood together, watching the children play. "They remind me that life is about more than responsibilities and business," David replied, his gaze focused on the children. "There's beauty in simplicity." His words resonated deeply with Julia. For the first time, she felt that David was genuinely ready to change, to relinquish some of the control he had always held so tightly in exchange for something more meaningful. When they returned to the mansion, David made a decision that left Julia speechless. He gathered his lawyers and spent hours revising the contract. Several clauses were adjusted to ensure that Julia would have more freedom and, most importantly, the right to maintain contact with Ben after the baby's birth. When he presented the revised contract to her, Julia's hands trembled as she held the document. She was visibly moved by the gesture, overwhelmed by the significance of what he had done. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion. David's expression softened as he met her gaze. "Because I want you to know you're not alone in this," he said. "I don't want you to feel trapped. I want you to stay because you trust me, not because you're obligated." His words carried a sincerity that left Julia momentarily speechless. For so long she had felt confined by the terms of the contract, her every move dictated by its rigid structure. But now, for the first time, she felt like an equal partner in their journey. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than I can say." David nodded, his eyes filled with quiet determination. "It's the least I can do," he said. "I want to make this right, for both of us." That evening, as Julia sat alone in her room, the revised contract resting on the table, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. David's actions weren't just about amending the terms of their agreement, they were about building trust, about showing her that he valued her beyond the contract's obligations. For the first time, Julia allowed herself to believe that their relationship might be evolving into something real, something that went beyond the confines of their initial arrangement. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she felt ready to face it, because now she knew she wasn't facing it alone. Tears streamed down Julia's face, but this time they weren't from sadness, they were tears of relief and gratitude. David's willingness to amend the contract and show her that she wasn't alone had lifted a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. As the days passed, the bond between them grew stronger. Their once formal conversations now flowed naturally, filled with stories, dreams, and fears. Slowly, they were building a foundation for something that felt more genuine, something that could withstand the uncertainties ahead. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows, David broke the silence. "Julia," he began, his tone steady but thoughtful, "I want to meet Ben." The suggestion caught Julia completely off guard. She remained silent for a moment, processing what he had said. "Are you sure?" she asked hesitantly, her voice betraying a mix of hope and fear. "Absolutely," David replied without hesitation. "He's part of you and I want to know every part of your life." Julia felt her heart warm at his words. His willingness to include Ben in their lives was a clear sign of his commitment to building something real, something that went beyond the terms of their agreement. The trip to visit Ben was filled with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. David appeared calm, his usual composure intact, but Julia could sense the nervous energy beneath the surface. She too felt her emotions swirling as they neared the place where her son was waiting. When they arrived, the sight of Ben running toward her brought instant tears to Julia's eyes. He threw himself into her arms, his laughter filling the air. "Mommy," he exclaimed joyfully, clinging to her as though he would never let go. Julia held him tightly, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. David stood nearby, watching the reunion with a soft smile. The tenderness in his expression was unmistakable, a glimpse of the man who had been steadily revealing himself to Julia over the past few weeks. When Julia introduced Ben to David, the little boy looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are you Mommy's friend?" he asked innocently. David crouched down to Ben's level, his voice gentle. "Yes, I am. And I hope we can be friends too." Ben smiled shyly, and Julia felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't just the moment, it was the promise it held, the possibility of a life where they could all be together. As they spent the day with Ben, the connection between the three of them began to take shape. David's kindness and patience with her son were more than Julia had hoped for, and by the time they returned to the mansion, her heart was filled with cautious optimism. That night, as she lay in bed, Julia allowed herself to imagine a future that included all of them. A life that wasn't defined by contracts or fears but by love, trust, and the family they were slowly becoming. As Ben looked up at David with wide, curious eyes, he asked innocently, "Are you my mom's friend?" David knelt to meet the boy's eye level, his expression soft. "Yes, I am," he replied warmly. "And I hope we can be friends too." Ben smiled shyly, and Julia felt a wave of relief and happiness wash over her. The interaction between David and her son was natural, almost effortless, as if Ben could sense that David was a safe and kind presence. Back at the mansion, Julia began to feel that, for the first time, she was building something truly solid. Her relationship with David was no longer defined solely by the terms of their contract but by trust and genuine feelings that had grown between them. Yet, she knew the road ahead would demand courage and patience. The challenges they faced weren't simple, and the choices they had to make would shape not just their future but Ben's as well. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, David reached for Julia's hand. The gesture was small but carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "I know we still have a lot to face," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the sky above. "But I want you to know I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Julia felt her heart swell with hope at his words. For the first time, she truly believed that a future together was not just possible, it was within reach. Life at the mansion began to feel increasingly familiar to Julia. The once intimidating halls no longer felt so cold, and the staff, particularly Amira, treated her with warmth and kindness. The bond between Julia and David, however, was still developing. After their visit with Ben, something had shifted, a deeper understanding, a shared commitment to building a life that included all of them. Though uncertainty still loomed, the foundation they were creating together gave Julia a sense of stability she hadn't felt in years. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and obligation, was slowly becoming a place of connection and possibility, a home. As Julia reflected on how far they had come, she realized that their journey was no longer just about fulfilling a contract. It was about building something real, one step at a time, with the hope and trust they were learning to place in each other. David had become more attentive, more present, as though he was beginning to fully understand the depth of Julia's life before she stepped into his. His demeanor, once guarded and distant, now carried a quiet determination to bridge the gap between their worlds. One morning, as they sat on the terrace sipping coffee, David broke the silence with an unexpected suggestion. "I want Ben to live here," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. Julia's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you serious?" she asked, struggling to process the weight of his words. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "If we're going to build something together, I want him to be part of it from the beginning." Julia's heart raced. The thought of having her son close, of being able to share her days with him in the same space, was everything she had hoped for. But doubts lingered, the complexities of their arrangement pressing heavily on her mind. "And what about the contract?" she questioned hesitantly, her voice laced with uncertainty. David took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "The contract doesn't have to be a barrier," he said. "We can adjust the terms to ensure Ben has a place here without compromising anything." Julia remained silent for a moment, deeply moved by David's willingness to adapt his life for her and her son. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any words ever could. Preparations for Ben's arrival began immediately. David instructed Amira to prepare a room for him, asking Julia to add her personal touches to make it feel familiar and welcoming. The space quickly transformed, decorated with elements that reminded Julia of their home, bright colors, books Ben loved, and toys she knew would bring him comfort. As the room came together, Julia felt a growing sense of hope. David's actions weren't just about practicality, they were a clear declaration of his commitment to building a life that included both her and her son. When the day finally came for Ben to move in, Julia's heart swelled with anticipation and nerves. Watching David take such deliberate steps to include her son in their world solidified something she had been afraid to fully believe in: the possibility of a future where they could all be together, not as individuals bound by a contract, but as a family. Though doubts and challenges remained, Julia knew they were making progress. With each step they took, they were building something stronger, something real. And as the mansion filled with the sounds of preparation and anticipation, it began to feel less like a gilded cage and more like the home she had longed for. Julia wanted the room for Ben to feel warm and familiar, filled with touches that reminded him of the home they had shared. Bright colors, his favorite books, and toys carefully placed on shelves all came together to create a space that felt like his own. On the day of Ben's arrival, Julia was filled with both anticipation and nervousness. When the mansion doors opened and Ben ran into her arms, her worries momentarily melted away. She held him tightly as if shielding him from everything unfamiliar. "This place is huge, Mom," Ben exclaimed, his wide eyes scanning the grand hall with awe. David, who had been observing quietly from a distance, approached slowly. He knelt to Ben's level and extended his hand. "Welcome, Ben. I hope you'll like it here," he said, his tone calm and sincere. Ben hesitated for a moment before shaking David's hand with a shy smile. "Thank you, sir." David smiled in return, and Julia noticed something remarkable. Despite his usual seriousness, there was a genuine effort to connect with her son. The first few days were a mix of adjustments and discoveries. Ben, with his boundless curiosity, quickly adapted to the luxurious environment of the mansion, exploring every corner and asking endless questions about everything he encountered. David, though reserved, showed patience and genuine interest. He answered each of Ben's questions calmly, his quiet engagement leaving Julia both surprised and touched. One night, as Julia tucked Ben into bed, he looked up at her with thoughtful eyes. "Mom," he asked softly, "is Mr. David a good man?" Julia was caught off guard by the question, but she smiled, her heart full as she considered her answer. "Yes, sweetheart," she said gently. "He is. He's learning to be better every day." Ben seemed satisfied with her answer, his small smile a reflection of the trust he was beginning to place in David. As Julia watched her son drift off to sleep, she felt a mix of relief and gratitude. The mansion, once a place she had entered with hesitation, was slowly transforming into a space where she and Ben could begin to build a new chapter of their lives. David's effort to include Ben wasn't just a gesture, it was a commitment, a sign that he was willing to adapt his world to make room for them both. And with each passing day, Julia felt the bonds between them grow stronger, a fragile but promising foundation for the life they were beginning to build together. "He is," Julia answered honestly, her voice steady as she looked into Ben's curious eyes. "He's learning to be better every day." Ben smiled, satisfied with her response, and soon drifted off to sleep. Julia remained by his side, watching his peaceful face illuminated by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she was on the right path. Over time, a bond began to form between David and Ben. Afternoons were spent playing chess or walking through the gardens, and Julia watched as David's demeanor shifted. The once distant man revealed a more relaxed and caring side in Ben's presence. During one of their walks, Ben suddenly stopped, tilting his head as he looked up at David with the innocent curiosity only a child could possess. "Do you like my mom?" he asked, his voice as straightforward as his question. David chuckled, caught off guard by Ben's frankness. He crouched down to meet Ben's gaze. "I do," he replied sincerely. "She's a very special woman." Ben grinned, satisfied, and resumed walking. David remained still for a moment, a faint smile playing on his lips as he watched the boy skip ahead. That simple yet meaningful exchange was a sign of the growing connection between them, one built on trust and genuine affection. One afternoon, Julia found David in his office, engrossed in a stack of documents. She entered slowly, hesitating at the doorway before clearing her throat. "Can I interrupt?" she asked, holding a cup of tea in her hands. David looked up, his expression softening as he saw her. "Always," he replied with a smile. Julia walked over to the nearby sofa, setting the cup on the edge of his desk before taking a seat. She watched him for a moment as he returned his focus to the papers in front of him. There was something comforting about seeing him in his element, his dedication and calm attention to detail a reflection of the man she was coming to understand more deeply. "Thank you for everything you've done for Ben," Julia said softly, breaking the silence. David paused, looking up at her. "It's not just for him," he said, his voice quiet but filled with meaning. "It's for us." Julia's heart swelled at his words. The road ahead was still uncertain, but with each passing day, the walls between them continued to crumble, replaced by something stronger, something real. For the first time, Julia felt like the pieces of her life were beginning to fit together, and she allowed herself to hope that they were building something that could endure beyond the confines of the mansion and the shadows of their pasts. There was something deeply reassuring about watching David work. His focus and dedication radiated stability and purpose. Julia couldn't help but break the silence. "You're working so hard for us," she said softly. David set down his pen and looked at her directly, his gaze steady. "Because you're worth it," he replied simply. The simplicity of his words made Julia's heart race. In that moment, she knew that despite all the challenges they had faced, they were building something real together. The months seemed to fly by, and the mansion was filled with a new energy. The relationship between David and Julia deepened, each shared experience bringing them closer. Ben had become an essential part of their lives, his laughter and curiosity breathing life into the once cold halls of the mansion. Their bond flourished amidst new experiences, and the anticipation of the baby's arrival only brought them closer. David, who had once kept his emotions carefully guarded, now showed moments of tenderness and care that left Julia feeling more secure in the life they were building. One evening, as Julia rested on the terrace, enjoying the cool breeze and the serene view, she felt a slight discomfort in her abdomen. Assuming it was just another pregnancy symptom, she tried to ignore it, but the pain grew more intense with each passing minute. Alarmed, she called for Amira, who immediately recognized the urgency of the situation. "Layla is going into labor," Amira announced as she rushed to find David, her voice filled with urgency. David ran to the bedroom, his usual composure replaced with visible concern. He found Julia breathless, struggling to manage the contractions. "We're going to the hospital," he said firmly, his voice steady but laced with urgency. Without hesitation, he helped Julia into the car, his hand never leaving hers as they made their way to the hospital. His calm reassurances and the determination in his eyes gave Julia the strength to face the moment ahead. Though the road to this point had been anything but smooth, Julia couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. In David's presence, she felt supported, cared for, and no longer alone in the challenges they faced. Together they were building a family, one born not out of obligation but of love and trust. "Now," David said firmly, gripping Julia's hand as they rushed to the hospital. The tension in the car was palpable. Despite his usual composure, David couldn't hide the worry etched across his face. His other hand held hers tightly, his voice steady but filled with emotion as he whispered words of encouragement. "Everything will be fine, Julia," he repeated softly, his anxious eyes never leaving hers. "I'm here with you." Upon their arrival, the medical team quickly took over, guiding Julia to the delivery room. But David refused to leave her side. He stayed with her throughout the labor, his hand in hers, his voice a constant source of support as he encouraged her through every difficult moment. After hours of struggle and determination, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. David looked up, a tiny boy cradled in his arms, his heart overflowing with emotion. "He's beautiful, Julia." "Perfect," he said, tears welling in his eyes as he looked down at their child. Julia, exhausted but overjoyed, smiled through her own tears. In that moment nothing else mattered. It was a moment of pure love and triumph, marking the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A few days later, Julia rested in the bedroom, the baby cradled gently in her arms. The serenity of the moment was interrupted when David entered, an envelope in his hand. His expression was serious, but his eyes shone with tenderness. "Julia," he began as he sat beside her, his voice steady yet emotional, "I want you to know something." He opened the envelope, the significance of his actions hanging in the air. Whatever he was about to say, Julia knew it would be something that would change the course of their journey yet again. David's gaze softened as he looked at her, the weight of everything they had endured and everything they had become evident in his eyes. In that moment, Julia felt the undeniable truth: they weren't just bound by circumstance anymore. They were building something real, something lasting, together. "This contract no longer holds any value," David said firmly, holding the envelope in his hands. Julia's eyes widened in surprise as, without hesitation, he tore the document into small pieces, letting them fall to the floor like scattered remnants of their past. "Everything I've done so far has been for you and for our family," he continued, his voice steady with emotion. "I don't want anything, not even a contract, to define our future." David reached for Julia's hands, his gaze full of love as he knelt before her. "Julia," he said, his voice filled with conviction, "you've brought light into my life. You've taught me what true love is and what it means to have a family. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, raising our children and facing whatever comes our way, together." With that, he opened a small velvet box, revealing a delicate ring with a diamond that sparkled softly in the light. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice tender but certain. Tears streamed down Julia's face, her heart racing with joy as she struggled to find her voice. Finally she managed to whisper, "Yes, David, I will." At that moment, Ben, who had been peeking through the door, ran toward them with an excited shout. "We're going to be a real family," he exclaimed, his face beaming with happiness. David lifted the boy into his arms and together, the three of them celebrated the moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The months leading up to their wedding were filled with joy and anticipation. The mansion, once a place of formality and obligation, was now filled with laughter, warmth, and the promise of a brighter future. Every step they took together reinforced the foundation they had built, not out of obligation but out of love, trust, and the shared dream of a life worth fighting for. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with joy, anticipation, and meticulous preparations. Julia wanted a ceremony that reflected her roots and the love she and David had built together. David, ever attentive, made sure to fulfill her every wish, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The mansion transformed into a fairy tale setting, adorned with exotic flowers, delicate lights, and decorations that beautifully blended both Western and traditional elements. The atmosphere was magical, a true reflection of the journey they had taken together. Finally the big day arrived. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the lush garden where the ceremony would take place. Julia looked radiant in a stunning white dress with golden accents, her beauty matched only by the joy in her eyes. Ben, dressed in a small formal suit, proudly carried the rings, his excitement evident as he walked ahead of his mother. As Julia made her way down the aisle, David's eyes filled with emotion. He watched her with admiration as though he were seeing her for the first time. When she reached him, he leaned in and whispered, "You look breathtaking." The vows they exchanged were simple yet deeply meaningful. They promised love, respect, and partnership, their words carrying the weight of their shared journey. When they sealed their commitment with a kiss, the guests erupted into heartfelt applause. The reception that followed was a celebration of cultures and love. Traditional Arabic music blended seamlessly with melodies from Julia's homeland, creating an atmosphere that was both festive and deeply personal. As family and friends danced, laughed, and celebrated, the mansion came alive with joy and warmth. Ben ran around the garden, thrilled to be part of the celebration, his laughter echoing through the air. For Julia and David, it was more than just a wedding, it was the culmination of their journey, a moment that symbolized the life they had chosen to build together. As the evening wore on and the stars began to shine, they shared a quiet dance beneath the twinkling lights, their hearts full of gratitude for the love they had found in each other. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with hope, unity, and the promise of a future they would face hand in hand. The reception was filled with a festive and warm atmosphere. Ben ran around the hall, his laughter echoing as he played with his new baby brother, his excitement uncontainable. Julia watched the scene beside David, her heart full as she took in the life they were building together. "This is the start of everything I've ever dreamed of," Julia said softly, her voice laced with emotion. David turned to her, his hand gently finding hers. "And it's only the beginning," he replied with a smile, his gaze filled with love and promise. By the end of the night, under a starry sky, Julia and David shared a dance, surrounded by their closest family and friends. The night felt magical, a celebration of a love that had overcome every obstacle and grown into something extraordinary. As they swayed together, Julia couldn't help but reflect on their journey, the unexpected way it had begun, the struggles they had faced and the connection they had built. It was a story of resilience, trust, and the power of love. Nearby, Ben continued to play with his baby brother, his laughter a reminder of the joy that now filled their lives. Julia and David exchanged glances, unspoken promises passing between them to face whatever challenges the future might bring. They knew they had everything they needed: love, unity, and a family that would continue to grow stronger with each passing day. Under the shining desert stars, their story reached its perfect conclusion, a new beginning filled with hope, happiness, and love. What do you think? Did Julia make the right decision by trusting David and building a life with him? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings about this heartwarming story in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate Julia and David's journey? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of love, hope, and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to Soul Deep Stories and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps us bring more meaningful stories to life. Stay tuned and let these stories continue to inspire and touch your soul. Thank you for being part of the Soul Deep Stories family. Love always exists in every corner and every circumstance. Only love and sincere gratitude can keep two people together forever and bring lasting happiness. Thank you for listening to this wonderful story, and I wish you eternal happiness in this life. I love you. The story between David and Julia is not just a journey of love between two people, but also a process of self-discovery, overcoming limitations and facing life's challenges. The narrative vividly portrays the transformation in their relationship, from a cold, binding contract to a sincere love, where affection and trust replace all the terms and conditions. Particularly, the development of David's character stands out as a brilliant highlight in the story. He is not just a cold, imposing man, but through various stages he gradually reveals his kindness, vulnerability, and sincerity. This creates a deep connection between him and Julia, allowing readers to feel the power of love and healing the wounds of both characters. This story carries a profoundly powerful message. Love not only exists in moments of happiness but can also overcome the harshest challenges. It shows that when we place our trust and love in someone, miracles can happen, leading us to a life filled with meaning.